The town of Millbrook, nestled between rolling hills and dense forests, carried the weight of history in its cobblestone streets and weathered storefronts. Once a bustling hub for returning soldiers, its patriotic charm now masked simmering undercurrents of unease. On a warm summer evening, as cicadas hummed their timeless song, the Anderson home stood as a testament to resilience. Its porch light flickered, casting shadows on the flagpole where Old Glory swayed gently in the breeze. Inside, James Anderson sat by a desk cluttered with relics of his military past, maps, faded photographs, and commendations that whispered stories of valor. His sharp gaze lingered on a letter from his son, Michael, stationed overseas, a reminder of the sacrifices their family had endured. Down the hall, Sarah Anderson moved with quiet purpose, arranging a bouquet of wildflowers in the dining room. The faint scent of apple pie still clung to the air, though the evening's events had soured its sweetness. Across town, Aisha Johnson paced her modest office, her brow furrowed as she reviewed a troubling report. The data spoke volumes: arrests disproportionately targeting minorities, complaints dismissed without investigation, and a police force seemingly untouchable. Her recent election to the city council had been hard-won, but the challenges ahead were daunting. She paused, her fingers brushing the edge of a framed photo of her late father, a civil rights lawyer who had taught her the value of persistence. Meanwhile, Tyler Chin, armed with little more than a laptop and a relentless curiosity, sifted through public records in his cramped apartment. The rookie journalist's corkboard was a chaotic tapestry of connections, names, dates, and incidents that hinted at a systemic issue. His instincts told him he was onto something bigger than a single story, something that could shake Millbrook to its core. As the town settled into the quiet of the night, an unspoken tension hung heavy in the air. From the Andersons' porch to the council chambers and newsroom, a storm was brewing, one that would test the courage of those willing to confront the truth and demand justice. The story unfolds in the sprawling, luminous city of Lyrathis, a metropolis suspended above an endless ocean of clouds. Lyrathis is powered by ancient, floating crystals that emit soft, ethereal light, casting the city in perpetual twilight. The city's architecture is a blend of sleek, metallic spires and intricate, vine-like structures that pulse with faint energy. Beneath the surface beauty, however, lies a society fractured by class. The wealthy elite live in the upper levels, basking in luxury, while the lower tiers are filled with sprawling markets, mechanical workshops, and shadowy alleys where survival is a daily struggle. At the heart of the story is Kale, a resourceful scavenger from the lower tiers. Orphaned as a child, Kale grew up navigating the labyrinthine underbelly of Lyrathis, salvaging scraps of crystal energy to sell for survival. Kale's sharp wit and mechanical skills make him a natural problem solver, but his guarded nature keeps others at arm's length. His only companion is Nia, a spirited young woman with a mysterious past. Nia claims to have once lived in the upper tiers, but her reasons for descending to the lower levels remain unclear. Despite her cheerful demeanor, she carries a hidden sorrow that occasionally surfaces in fleeting moments of vulnerability. Their lives take a turn when they encounter Aaron, a stoic enforcer from the upper tiers who has been exiled for defying her superiors. Aaron is driven by a desire to uncover the truth behind the corruption that plagues Lyrathis, but her rigid sense of duty often clashes with Kale's survival-driven pragmatism. Despite their differences, the trio forms an uneasy alliance when they discover a dormant crystal artifact that could either restore balance to the city or plunge it into chaos. As they journey through Lyrathis, their motivations evolve. Kale seeks freedom from the oppressive system, Nia hopes to reconcile with her past, and Aaron aims to redeem herself. Their intertwined fates will determine the future of the city they call home. The arrest of Sarah Anderson unraveled a sinister web of corruption, as James uncovered a covert police operation targeting marginalized residents under the guise of community safety. Aisha Johnson's counsel findings and Tyler Chen's exposé collided with Marcus Washington's activism, exposing a decades-old conspiracy that tied Millbrook's power brokers to systemic abuse and cover-ups. The small coastal town of Havenridge had always been a quiet refuge, but for Clara, a young marine biologist, it was the perfect place to conduct her groundbreaking research on bioluminescent algae. Her goal was to uncover how these organisms could revolutionize sustainable energy. Meanwhile, Ethan, a local fisherman struggling to keep his family's generational business afloat, had a simpler dream: to preserve the waters that had provided for his family for decades. Their paths crossed when Clara's research inadvertently disrupted Ethan's fishing routes, sparking an immediate clash. Despite their initial animosity, a shared concern for the ocean's health began to bridge their differences. Clara's meticulous scientific approach contrasted sharply with Ethan's instinctive understanding of the sea, creating a dynamic where both challenged and learned from each other. However, their collaboration faced its first major obstacle when a large corporation announced plans to build a factory near the coastline, threatening the delicate ecosystem they both cherished. Clara saw this as a chance to prove the algae's potential, while Ethan feared the factory would destroy his livelihood. As they worked together to rally the community against the corporation, tensions rose within Havenridge. Some residents, lured by promises of jobs, supported the factory, creating a rift among neighbors. Clara's assistant, Mia, a tech-savvy intern with a knack for social media, suggested using online platforms to amplify their cause. Meanwhile, Ethan's younger brother, Sam, secretly considered taking a job with the corporation, adding strain to their already fragile family bond. Amid the mounting challenges, Clara and Ethan found themselves growing closer, their shared dedication deepening into mutual respect and unspoken affection. However, when the corporation's representatives offered Clara funding for her research in exchange for her silence, she faced a moral dilemma. Her decision would not only test her integrity but also her burgeoning partnership with Ethan, setting the stage for a battle that would define their futures. The morning began like any other in the quiet town of Ashwood. The streets were lined with dew-kissed leaves, and the hum of life carried on in its usual rhythm. For Clara, a diligent journalist at the local paper, it was just another day of chasing mundane stories. She had no idea her life was about to be upended. As she sipped her coffee and scanned her emails, a peculiar message appeared in her inbox. The subject line read, "Urgent, they're watching." Intrigued and slightly unnerved, she opened it. The email contained a cryptic warning about a powerful organization operating in the shadows, accompanied by a grainy photograph of a man she didn't recognize. Moments later, her phone buzzed. It was an anonymous caller. "You've seen too much," the voice said before the line went dead. Clara's heart pounded in her chest. She glanced around her apartment, suddenly feeling exposed. Who had sent the email? And why did they think she was involved? Her routine shattered, Clara knew she couldn't ignore the strange events. She forwarded the email to her tech-savvy friend, Liam, hoping he could trace its origin. But before she could even explain, the power in her apartment flickered out. The hum of her refrigerator stopped, the lights dimmed, and her laptop screen went black. Peering out her window, she noticed her entire block was plunged into darkness. A black SUV idled suspiciously at the corner. Clara's instincts screamed at her to act. Grabbing her bag, she slipped out the back door, her mind racing with questions. Who was targeting her, and why? As she hurried through the alleyways, she realized she couldn't return to her normal life, not until she uncovered the truth. The email wasn't just a warning, it was a call to action. And Clara wasn't about to back down. The following morning, Millbrook awoke to an uneasy quiet, the kind that hinted at a storm brewing beneath the surface. At the local diner, a hub for gossip and coffee refills, whispers of Sarah Anderson's arrest had already spread. Patrons exchanged incredulous glances, their disbelief palpable. Sarah, the woman who baked pies for every town fundraiser, accused of trespassing? It didn't sit right with anyone. At Millbrook High School, history teacher Elena Martinez, 38, paused mid-lesson as her phone buzzed with a notification. A parent had sent her a link to a social media post about the incident. Elena's stomach churned as she read the details. She had long suspected that the town's outward charm masked deeper issues, but this felt personal. Sarah had been one of the few people who had welcomed Elena, a Latina newcomer, with warmth when she first moved to Millbrook. Meanwhile, at the police station, Officer Derek Simmons sat at his desk, his knee bouncing nervously. He replayed the previous night's events in his head, the image of James Anderson's piercing stare haunting him. Simmons wasn't blind to the growing unrest within the department. Rumors of quotas, implicit biases, and unspoken orders had circulated for months, but he had always convinced himself it wasn't his problem. Now, it felt unavoidable. Across town, Aisha Johnson was already on her second cup of coffee, her desk cluttered with files. She had reached out to Sarah's son, Michael, who had confirmed his mother's arrest. Aisha's heart ached as she thought of Sarah, a woman she had met during a community project, now caught in the crosshairs of systemic injustice. Determined, she began drafting a formal inquiry to the police department, her resolve hardening with each word she typed. At the Gazette, Tyler Chen's corkboard had grown overnight. He had uncovered a series of complaints filed against Officer Cooper, all quietly dismissed. His editor had warned him to tread carefully, but Tyler knew this was the story that could define his career. As he stared at the tangled web of evidence, he felt both exhilarated and terrified. By mid-afternoon, James Anderson had made his first call, to Marcus Washington. The two veterans hadn't spoken in years, their paths diverging after Vietnam, but James knew Marcus's reputation as a fighter for justice was exactly what he needed. Marcus listened intently, his voice calm but resolute. "We've got work to do, James," he said. "This isn't just about Sarah. It's about all of us." As the sun dipped below the horizon, Millbrook's idyllic facade began to crack. In living rooms, offices, and coffee shops, conversations about fairness, accountability, and change were taking root. What had started as a single unjust arrest was rapidly evolving into a movement, a call to action that would challenge the very foundation of the town's identity. The next morning, James Anderson sat at the dining table, his untouched coffee growing cold. His mind raced, replaying the events of the previous evening. The humiliation of Sarah's arrest burned in his chest, but it was the look in her eyes that haunted him most, confusion, fear, and betrayal. James opened his laptop, his hands steady now as he began drafting an email to an old Army buddy who now worked in federal law enforcement. He wasn't just a retired soldier anymore, he was a man on a mission. Across town, Aisha Johnson stared at her computer screen, her lips pressed into a thin line. The arrest of Sarah Anderson had reached her desk through an anonymous tip. Aisha had always admired Sarah from afar. The Andersons were pillars of the community, and Sarah's volunteer work at the local food bank was well known. Aisha felt a pang of anger. If someone like Sarah wasn't safe from the overreach of Millbrook's police, what did that mean for others in the community? Her fingers flew over the keyboard as she drafted a proposal for an emergency council meeting. Meanwhile, Tyler Chen's investigation was gaining traction. He had uncovered a startling pattern. A small group of officers, including Bradley Cooper and Derek Simmons, had been involved in a disproportionate number of complaints. Many of these cases had been quietly dismissed, their records buried under layers of bureaucracy. Tyler's editor had warned him to tread carefully, but Tyler was determined. He pinned a new photo to his corkboard, a smiling Sarah Anderson at a community event, surrounded by children. This wasn't just a story anymore, it was personal. At the community center, Marcus Washington gathered a group of activists and local leaders. "This isn't just about Sarah," he said, his voice steady but impassioned. "This is about a system that's been broken for too long. We need to act now." Plans for a town hall began to take shape, and Marcus made a mental note to reach out to James. He knew the retired captain's voice would carry weight in a town that revered its veterans. As the day unfolded, Sarah sat alone in a holding cell, her mind a whirlwind of emotions. She replayed the officer's cold words, the tight grip of the handcuffs, and the humiliating ride in the back of the cruiser. But beneath her fear, a quiet resolve began to form. Sarah wasn't just a victim, she was a fighter. She thought of James and Michael, of the life they had built together, and vowed that this injustice would not define her. By evening, the Andersons' home buzzed with activity. Michael had arrived, his face a mask of fury as he paced the living room. "This isn't just about Mom," he said, his voice rising. "This is about what's happening to this town." James nodded, his voice calm but firm. "Then we fight," he said simply. Together, the family began to strategize, their shared determination a beacon of hope in the growing storm. As night fell, the threads of resistance began to weave together. Aisha's council proposal gained traction, Tyler's article neared completion, and Marcus's town hall plan solidified. Unbeknownst to them all, their paths were converging, setting the stage for a reckoning that would challenge Millbrook's very foundation. The following morning, James Anderson sat at the kitchen table, his hands wrapped around a mug of coffee that had long gone cold. The events of the previous evening played on a loop in his mind, each detail sharpening his resolve. Across from him, Michael, his 35-year-old son and an attorney, sifted through legal documents. His normally easygoing demeanor was replaced by a steely focus. "This isn't just about Mom," Michael said, his voice low. "This is systemic, Dad. It's bigger than us." At City Hall, Aisha Johnson adjusted her glasses as she prepared for an emergency council meeting. The arrest of Sarah Anderson had sent shockwaves through the community, and her inbox was flooded with messages ranging from outrage to fear. For Aisha, this was no longer just another policy issue. It was personal. Her own experiences with discrimination growing up in Millbrook fueled her determination to hold the police accountable. She glanced at her notes, the words "independent investigation" underlined twice. Meanwhile, Tyler Chen's fingers flew across his keyboard as he finalized an exposé for the Millbrook Gazette. His research had uncovered a disturbing pattern of racial profiling and misconduct within the police department, dating back years. The wrongful arrest of Sarah Anderson was the latest in a string of incidents that painted a damning picture. Tyler hesitated for a moment, knowing the risks of publishing such a story in a town like Millbrook, but his conscience left him no choice. At the community center, Marcus Washington stood before a small but growing crowd of activists, veterans, and concerned citizens. His voice, though weathered with age, carried the same conviction that had driven him during the civil rights movement decades earlier. "This isn't just about one family," he declared. "This is about the soul of Millbrook. We stand together, or we fall apart." By evening, James made a call to an old military contact, Colonel Rebecca Hayes, now a prominent advocate for veterans' rights. As he explained the situation, her voice on the other end was firm. "You stood for justice overseas, Captain. Now it's time to fight for it at home. You have my support." The town of Millbrook was no longer a quiet haven. Lines were being drawn, alliances formed, and the Andersons found themselves at the center of a storm that would test their strength and unity. The battle for accountability and justice had begun, and the stakes could not be higher. The Anderson home was quiet, save for the faint ticking of the kitchen clock and the distant hum of crickets outside. James sat at the dining table, his hands clasped tightly, staring at the untouched place setting meant for Sarah. The weight of her absence pressed down on him, but his mind was already working, piecing together a plan. He reached for his phone, scrolling through his contacts until he found the name he needed, Marcus Washington. Marcus had fought battles of his own, both in Vietnam and on the streets of Millbrook, and James knew he'd need his old friend's wisdom now more than ever. Across town, Aisha Johnson leaned back in her chair, her fingers drumming against the edge of her desk. The complaints she had been reviewing painted a grim picture, but Sarah Anderson's arrest was different. It wasn't just another statistic, it was a blatant injustice against a woman whose family had given so much to the nation. Aisha's jaw tightened as she picked up her phone, dialing Tyler Chen at the Gazette. "Tyler, I think I have something you'll want to see," she said, her voice steady but urgent. Meanwhile, Tyler was already deep into his investigation. The web of connections on his corkboard was growing, and Sarah's arrest had added a new thread. He had uncovered financial records linking certain police officers to questionable bonuses and promotions, patterns that coincided with arrests in specific neighborhoods. Tyler's pulse quickened as Aisha's call came through. Her insights could be the missing piece he needed to expose the corruption festering within the department. At the police station, Sarah sat in a holding cell, her mind racing. Fear threatened to overwhelm her, but she forced herself to focus. She replayed the officer's words and actions, searching for anything that might help her case. Nearby, Officer Simmons glanced nervously at Cooper. "You sure about this?" Cooper's expression hardened, but the flicker of doubt in his eyes betrayed him. As the night deepened, alliances began to form. James and Marcus were already strategizing, their combined experiences shaping a plan that would demand both courage and precision. Aisha and Tyler prepared to share their findings, their growing partnership fueled by a shared determination to uncover the truth. And within the department, cracks began to show, as guilt and fear threatened to unravel the officers' resolve. Unbeknownst to them all, the ripples of Sarah's arrest were spreading, drawing in allies and adversaries alike. The battle lines were being drawn, and Millbrook was on the brink of a reckoning that would leave no one untouched. The quiet of Millbrook was deceptive now, a fragile veneer over the storm brewing beneath. James Anderson sat at his dining table, the box of his military past open before him. His hands hovered over a Rolodex of old contacts, names of people who owed him favors or shared his unyielding sense of justice. He knew this wasn't just about Sarah anymore, it was about a system that had failed the town he'd fought to protect. The weight of his next steps pressed on him, but his resolve was unshakable. Across town, Aisha Johnson stared at her computer screen, the complaints she'd been analyzing now forming a damning mosaic. The arrest of Sarah Anderson was just the latest in a troubling pattern, but it was also the most public. Aisha's heart raced as she drafted an emergency motion for the city council, knowing she'd face resistance from those who preferred to keep the status quo intact. Her position was precarious, but she couldn't stay silent. Meanwhile, Tyler Chen's fingers flew across his keyboard, the pieces of his investigation finally clicking into place. He'd uncovered a network of internal memos and whistleblower accounts pointing to systemic abuses within the Millbrook Police Department. But publishing the story meant risking his fledgling career. Tyler's editor had warned him to tread carefully, but the thought of Sarah Anderson's arrest, and what it symbolized, left him no choice. He printed out his draft, ready to take it to his editor one last time. At the community center, Marcus Washington ended his call with the ACLU and leaned back in his chair, staring at the ceiling. The fight for civil rights was one he thought he'd left behind decades ago, but Millbrook's unraveling had pulled him back into the fray. He knew the stakes were higher now, the town's unity hung by a thread. Marcus began drafting a plan for a town hall meeting, determined to rally the community. As Sarah sat in a holding cell, her mind raced with questions and fears. The betrayal of being treated like a stranger in her own home cut deep, but her faith in James, and in the truth, kept her steady. She prayed this injustice would be the catalyst for change, even as uncertainty loomed. The clock ticked toward a breaking point. Each player, driven by their own convictions, was unknowingly converging on the same battlefield. The fight for Millbrook's soul had begun, and none of them would emerge unchanged. As the sun dipped below the horizon, James Anderson stood resolute in the town hall, flanked by Aisha Johnson and Marcus Washington. The room buzzed with tension as townspeople packed the space, their faces a mixture of anger and hope. Tyler Chen, armed with a stack of damning evidence, took the floor, his voice steady as he presented his findings. The data painted a grim picture, a pattern of systemic bias and abuse of power within the Millbrook Police Department. Gasps rippled through the crowd as Tyler revealed the officers' histories, including prior complaints that had been quietly dismissed. Across the room, Chief Harold Mason sat stiffly, his face betraying a mix of defiance and unease. But the tide had turned. Aisha's voice rang out, clear and unwavering, as she called for an independent investigation into the department's practices. "This isn't just about one family," she declared, her gaze sweeping the room. "It's about ensuring that every resident of Millbrook is treated with dignity and respect. We cannot allow this to continue." Meanwhile, Sarah Anderson, now released and seated beside her husband, clasped his hand tightly. Though shaken, she refused to be silenced. "I've spent my life supporting a man who fought for this country," she said, her voice trembling but firm. "I never thought I'd have to fight for justice in my own hometown. But I will." Her words ignited a standing ovation, the crowd's applause echoing through the hall. By the meeting's end, a unanimous vote established an oversight committee, with Aisha, Marcus, and James at the helm. The officers involved were placed on administrative leave pending investigation. Outside, as the crowd dispersed, James looked at Sarah, his eyes filled with pride and determination. "This isn't over," he said. "But we're just getting started." The Andersons returned home to the scent of the now charred pie, a bittersweet reminder of the night's events. Yet, for the first time in days, hope filled the air. Millbrook had taken its first step toward justice, and its people were ready to see it through. The golden glow of Millbrook's evening had darkened into a restless night. James Anderson sat in his study, the box of old documents now open on his desk. Decades of service to his country had taught him the value of resilience, and tonight, that lesson burned brighter than ever. His fingers hovered over his phone, dialing numbers he hadn't called in years. Old comrades, legal advisors, and trusted friends were about to become allies in a new kind of battle, one fought not with weapons, but with truth and resolve. Across town, Aisha Johnson began drafting a formal inquiry to the Millbrook Police Department. Her pen moved with purpose, her resolve steeled by the knowledge that systemic change often began with small, courageous steps. She knew she couldn't do it alone. Reaching out to Marcus Washington, she proposed a town hall meeting to address the growing concerns about law enforcement practices. Together, they envisioned a platform where voices long silenced could finally be heard. Meanwhile, Tyler Chen's story was taking shape. His investigation had uncovered troubling patterns, from falsified reports to questionable arrests like Sarah Anderson's. As he pinned Sarah's photo to his corkboard, he felt the weight of responsibility settle on his shoulders. This wasn't just a story, it was a chance to expose a truth that could no longer be ignored. He vowed to ensure every detail was airtight, every fact irrefutable. In her holding cell, Sarah sat quietly, her hands folded in her lap. Though shaken, she found strength in the thought of James. She knew he wouldn't rest until her name was cleared. Her faith in him, and in the community they'd built their lives around, remained unbroken. This was not the end of her story, it was the beginning of something far greater. The events set in motion that evening would ripple far beyond the Anderson family. Millbrook was on the brink of transformation, its residents poised to confront the truths they had long avoided. As dawn approached, one thing was clear, change was coming, and it would demand courage from everyone. Now was the time for every citizen to ask themselves, what role would they play in shaping the future?